Morning, glory, evening, grace, brother and sister. Everybody back on with us here with our Temperance Awakening. As we start to wind down all our lectures, this is actually the next to last lecture that we'll be having here about alcohol for the time being. I'm pretty sure there will be other things in the future that we will give about alcohol, a program on here, some type of online program at least, to help people with alcohol addictions. And now looking at sexual behavior and alcohol. And so drinking alcohol and sexual intercourse are, connected, like in a number of ways. Like some people deliberately use alcohol to overcome shyness and initiate social or sexual contact with with an appropriate partner. Others believe that alcohol increases their sexual drive or performance, or at least makes them feel more relaxed and able to respond, to that partner. Combining, sexual intercourse and alcohol has a very big negative side, just all the way together. Alcohol, has led many people to give in to sex when they really want to say no. Sex and alcohol also may lead to unwanted pregnancy, like sexually transmitted diseases, violence, rape. Can cause guilt, fear, and broken relationships. And the problems here can just be enormous. So now, is alcohol, the question here, is alcohol an aphrodisiac? An aphrodisiac is a food or a drink that increases romantic or sexual desire. And according to most research, these aphrodisiacs really don't exist, although you could spend a bundle of money, like in stores now, especially on the internet, buying products that claim to do that trick. Yet for many people, one or two drinks have a relaxing effect, distracting them from their worries and loosening the control centers in their brains. And say that's why even, just one or two drinks can cause a lot of harm, more harm than you want. So, as a result, these people, they tend to feel more tender and loving at the right time and place, and, more aware, so to speak, of their natural sexual feelings. But on the other hand, drinking, whenever people continue drinking, though, just bad effects happen. Sexual intercourse obviously involves not one but two people, and therefore it needs sensitivity and attention, which usually go out the window when people are intoxicated. 99.9% of the time at least, maybe 100. And, and obviously the more a person drinks, then they're, not going to be able to perform anything. And, heavy drinking actually has lousy sex lives, and we've actually already covered that in previous lectures. Like some people believe that alcohol makes them more virile and desirable, and since they're often mistaken, that belief can lead to misunderstandings and serious troubles. And so now just look at that fact or fiction. Alcohol can improve a man's sexual performance. And this is mostly false. Some alcohol can cause a person to feel relaxed and feel sociable, although that's a very false feeling. It's a false high, just like nicotine is a false high. But a man's sex drive is actually declined by drinking of alcohol. The more you drink, the less you lose. That's why people who actually indulge in heavy drinking, can become impotent or even sterile. And then now looking at something that most people are somewhat familiar with. You've saw news clippings and things, and that is sexual coercion. And sexual coercion is when one person forces another person to simply have sexual intercourse against his or her will. And that can take, can take many forms. Probably the most extreme form is rape, the one people are the most familiar with, when one person forces the other to have sexual relations against his or her will. And a rape is a violent crime that is rightly punished by long prison sentences. It can inflict terrible emotional damage on its victims, as well as serious practical consequences, such as unwanted pregnancy, or sexually transmitted diseases. And alcohol use is strongly connected to rape. Both statistically, a high percentage of rapists drink before the rape, and also psychologically. Alcohol can prepare, so to speak, the rapist for the crime. And then coercion, though, also does include less extreme crimes, like such as sexual assault, where one person physically forces attentions on another person. As in the case of rape, sexual assault often involves alcohol. According to Alcohol Health and Research World, in the 1993, the journal reported studies showed that 1/3 to 3/4, so the numbers are a bit sketchy, but it's possible that 1/3 to 3/4, even if it's just 1/3, that's a lot, but 1/3 to 3/4 of all rapes and sexual assaults, the attacker or the victim, and often both of them, have been drinking. And the proportion is highest for particularly violent rapes. Some male rapists believe that women who drink are signaling that they're available for sex. And a survey reported by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in 1992 found that 39% of high school boys and 18% of girls agreed with that statement. And obviously that simply isn't true. If people put themselves in the victim's shoes, they would probably think differently. And so then, it's not surprising that many victims of sexual coercion have been drinking themselves. And that actually goes for a lot of crimes, a lot of victims of crimes, especially people who have been drinking at bars, who get robbed, and attacked, are often people who've been drinking as well. And especially, with women, that's very true. Women become intoxicated more quickly, after drinking the same amount of alcohol as a man. And once intoxicated, they may miss warning signs that they're in danger. And once they do understand, they're often not able to communicate their disapproval, forcefully enough. And when sexual attacks begin, victims who've been drinking, most of the time, they're not going to have the mental and physical resources they need to fight off an attacker. And after the rape is over, they may feel shame that they drank enough to put themselves in danger, or they might not remember enough of the details to be sure of what actually happened. And then when victims, regret their own actions, it doesn't excuse the rapist or the crime. It only highlights that taking advantage of someone against her will is a cowardly act as well as a criminal one. And then there is acquaintance rape. That's when the victim knew the perpetrator before the attack took place. And that's also often associated with alcohol. Like on college campuses, particularly, I believe we mentioned that before in previous lectures. According to a 2001 Justice Department report, nearly 90% of victims of rape or attempted rape on campuses personally knew the offender. And most of those, both the attacker and the victim, had been drinking. And then there's unintended sex. And people change their minds all the time about things, about relationships, who you want to date, who you want to be romantic with, as well as other things. And consenting adults might have every intention of engaging in sexual relations on a particular occasion, yet something gets in the way, for example, drinking too much, and the plans fall through. But in other cases, one or both of the parties may have no intention of having sex, but under the influence of alcohol, they change their minds. So it's not surprising that alcohol, the original disinhibitor, as they say, that allows people to do things they wouldn't do sober, can lead to unplanned sex. A 2002 study by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 29% of people between 15 and 17 years old admit that they're more sexually active than they plan to be due to alcohol and drug use. And that number rose to 37% for the 18 to 24 age group. A 1999 college survey reported by the Harvard University School of Public Health found that binge drinkers, that's men who drink 5 or more alcoholic drinks at a time, and women who drink 4 or more, were 5 times more likely to have unplanned sex as other students. Unintended sex is usually unprepared and unprotected sex as well. It's often unappreciated too the morning after. When sober, most people say that sex is important enough for them to carefully choose the time, place, and partner ahead of time. So under the influence of alcohol, people are just likely to stick to their own standards. And that is just the problem with alcohol. And now we're going to look at unprotected sex. So, it's just obvious. Sexual intercourse can have serious, deadly consequences. A woman of childbearing age, usually from the teenage to the middle-aged years, is at risk of becoming pregnant from just one single brief sexual encounter. Unless she or her partner are deliberately using birth control. Also, anyone who is careless about sex is at risk of getting a sexually transmitted disease, obviously, no matter what type of sexual behavior is involved. So common sense suggests that people who are drinking when they have sex are just less likely to use protection, since alcohol weakens the rational control centers of the brain. And the evidence from surveys isn't clear, though. One study published in 2003 in the journal Perspectives on Sexual and Reproductive Health found that teenagers were just as likely to use condoms after drinking alcohol than when they had not been drinking. However, some other studies show that men and women who drink and also use drugs are much less likely than others to use condoms during sex. And in those cases, it's hard to prove that alcohol is the cause of unprotected sex, but a careless disregard for risk, can certainly cause both behaviors. And of course, there's unwanted pregnancies. So, and the only guaranteed way to avoid unwanted pregnancy is to abstain from sex altogether. If a person is practicing abstinence like they should, if you're not married, it's easier to stick with your principles if you remain sober. The more a person drinks, thus likely they are to remain true to their values. And then there's also birth control pills, shots, patches, or skin implants which prevent ovulation, and intrauterine devices which block sperm from reaching the egg. None of these methods requires protective action at the time of sex, so alcohol doesn't increase the risk of pregnancy. Many women, especially young women, rely on condoms as their first line of defense, which means they must rely on men to use condoms as well. And to be fully effective, condoms have to be used correctly. People shouldn't use unopened condoms from an unbroken package that's not past its expiration date. And a number of other things. And then they're looking now at sexually transmitted diseases. Of course, that's something still around, was an epidemic of that, like back in the 1980s. Until the invention of antibiotics early in the 20th century, STDs were recognized as a very serious threat to public health. They were called venereal diseases. Syphilis, perhaps the most feared of the STDs, often led to insanity and death. Then the introduction of pills in the 1940s seemed to promise a world free of STDs. And before too long, however, the bacteria and other organisms that caused the most common STDs started developing resistance to penicillin and other antibiotic drugs. Today it takes larger and larger doses of antibiotics to knock out a syphilis or a gonorrhea infection. And even worse, the medical profession soon learned that serious virus infections, such as herpes and hepatitis B and C, were being widely spread through sexual contact. And the list of common STDs has, grown with time as well. Kind of like we said, since going back to the 1980s. The world has seemingly become a smaller place, and tiny disease-bearing organisms from all over the world seem to travel as easily as the most restless jet setter. This includes chlamydia, which can cause sterility, fungus infections, yeast infections, venereal lice, and human papillomavirus, which can cause cervical cancer. And in 1981, a new STD surfaced, and that is AIDS. AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome. Though it can also be passed from one person to another through contact with things such as infected blood, most people, get infected during sexual activity. And every year, about 15 million new cases of STDs occur in the United States alone, doesn't even include other countries. The two main risk factors that help spread STDs so widely are unprotected sex and multiple sexual partners. Unprotected sex allows the exchange of infected body fluids, like semen or traces of blood. An infected individual may have enough bacteria or virus particles in those body fluids to infect the healthy partner after just one sexual contact. This is possible even if the infected partner doesn't show any symptoms of the disease. Almost any type of sexual activity between unprotected partners has the potential of spreading STDs. The chances of transmission are increased if either partner has a sore skin infection to begin with, or if his or her skin is chapped or torn during sex. The risk of transmission during unprotected sex is 30% for herpes and up to 50% for gonorrhea. The most effective protection against STDs during sex is a latex condom. Other birth control methods, such as pills, IUDs, diaphragms, and spermicidal creams, do nothing to protect against STDs. Lambskin condoms have tiny holes big enough for HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, to pass through. So since alcohol can impair people's judgment and self-control, people have been drinking often, just neglect to use condoms or they fail to use them properly. Alcohol might play an even greater role in the other major risk factor for STDs, multiple sex partners. A study of young people aged 14 to 22 reported in the journal Family Planning Perspectives in 2001 found that 61% of boys and 44% of girls who drank or used drugs during their last sexual encounter had multiple partners in the previous 3 months, as compared with only 32% of boys and 14% of girls who'd been sober the last time they had sex. So just by the law of averages, the more partners an individual has, the more likely that they are to encounter an STD. And so now looking particularly at HIV and AIDS, like I said there, in 1981, physicians in several American cities detected an epidemic of a new disease that they named AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency disease. 2 years later, researchers discovered the organism that caused the disease, the human immunodeficiency virus, which is HIV, and they showed that it could be easily passed along during sexual contact. People can get infected with HIV through other means as well, such as sharing hypodermic needles or getting a transfusion of infected blood, but the large majority of victims have acquired the virus during sexual activity. If one unprotected partner has HIV, the other has a 1 to 4% chance of getting the virus during each sexual act. The risk depends on the particular act they perform. HIV does its damage by harming and eventually destroying the body's immune system. This process can take several years to develop. Once the immune system is damaged, the body becomes more vulnerable to dangerous and fatal illnesses, such as pneumonia, painful nerve inflammations, liver disease, and cancer. By 2002, according to the Center for Disease Control, AIDS had killed 501,000 Americans. It took some 15 years before drugs were developed that could control AIDS. Drugs discovered in the 1990s have been successful in holding off fatal complications in most patients, and AIDS deaths began to decline in the United States. But these drugs, though, are expensive, and they have not been available for most AIDS victims in poor countries. In 2002, according to the Joint United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, more than 3 million people in countries all over the world died of AIDS, bringing total deaths to 28 million in just 21 years. Some 5 million new people were infected with HIV in 2002, 40,000 of them in the United States. And new strains of HIV have begun to appear that the medicines cannot reach. In any case, these drugs only help people who are already sick. So far, nobody's been able to make a vaccine that can be given to healthy people to keep the virus away. When this epidemic first broke out in the U.S., most of the victims were homosexual men, and that has changed a long time ago as the virus spreads into wider communities. In most of the world, most people with AIDS are straight, heterosexual people, and about half of them are women. So due to the rise of AIDS, unprotected sex is far more dangerous than ever before. There's never been a better reason, to just abstain, from sexual intercourse with somebody other than your spouse. And that's true for males, females, all genders, people of all ages. It doesn't matter where you come from or what neighborhood you live in or, what ethnic group you are. HIV and AIDS is of no respect or persons to any of that. And, alcohol, especially used in large quantities, that just influences people to, to break their standards. And it can lead to a person having sex when they don't intend to or even want to. It impairs judgment. And, a pattern of alcohol abuse can lead to multiple partners. Like a study at Louisiana State University in 2003 suggests an even more direct link between alcohol and HIV. When alcohol is present in the bloodstream, researchers found the body may be more susceptible to being infected by HIV during sexual contact. Everybody knows that kids can make mistakes. It's part of growing up. But, getting AIDS or like an STD is just too high a price to pay, for something careless. So drinking and driving, is a dangerous combination. And drinking and sex, that's not really against, the laws per se. But, it is just as dangerous as drinking and driving. And so the most intelligent thing to do is to abstain from alcohol and sexual intercourse with anybody other than your own spouse. And so thanks for being with us here. Really important stuff that we looked at in this lecture. And as we said, our next alcohol lecture will be the kind of the last one for this period, just going off some of this helpful information. And so we'll see you next time. Until then, until that I break in the shadows flee away, I'm Dr. Coop and I love you and I appreciate you.